Well, first of all, what needs to be remembered is that Merseyside and Dorset are completely two different counties. The voting mentality, for example, is very different. Where I'm from, especially in Liverpool, there is a traditional Labour vote, which you could say stems back to the late 19th century, early 20th century Irish migration to the city.
It's an interesting point, and people even now, when I talk to colleagues in Parliament, they're staggered when I say that it's only been a safe Labour seat, so-called, since the war.
Yeah.
That's where war. And then I always tell them about the history before that. Yeah. Again, it goes back to immigration. Why there was liberal support here was because Home Rule in Ireland was very, very prominent throughout the 20s. Lloyd George, for example, and prominent members of the Liberal governments advocated Home Rule for the Irish, you see, and of course Bootle, and it still is, about 50% of the population are either Irish or second, third generation Irish. So that was the reason, but predominantly it was always a Tory seat. Yeah.
The mass migration that came from Ireland to Liverpool offered surrounding areas such as Bootle the support of the Liberals in the 1920s, and this also possibly led to the strong Labour support post-World War II, which has given Bootle increasing majorities ever since.
You go outside the city to areas such as the Wirral, it's Conservative. The Conservatives have a bit more of a say. You go to Southport, Labour have never won that seat.
This image, courtesy of Wikipedia, shows the predominantly Labour county of Merseyside. In the north, we can see the Lib Dem constituency of Southport, currently a Conservative Lib Dem marginal, as well as the Conservative Wirral West in the bottom left-hand corner. The seat currently held by Cabinet Minister Esther McVeigh is certainly a target for the Labour Party in this election.
Compared to Dorset, it's rather more of a grey vote area. You get a lot more people retiring coming to areas such as Bournemouth and Poole, and all over the county it's much more rural, and that tends to bring a more right-leaning Conservative vote.
Areas in Dorset, such as Christchurch shown here, have a higher than average over 65 population, with roughly 31% fitting into that category. This contrasts to the city of Liverpool, which has an over 65 population of around 14%.
If it was me standing, let me answer it this way, if it was me standing, I wouldn't be ignoring UKIP. I would be regarding them as a serious threat.
The Southport seat, which, like I mentioned, is a Lib Dem Conservative marginal seat, the national vote for the Lib Dems has dropped catastrophically over the past 5 years, and that could have an effect in Southport. I think another seat especially to look out for is Bootle. It's been a Labour seat since 1945. It was the safest seat in the country in 2001 and 2005, but the current MP, well, former MP now, has stood down, and a new face is coming in. On top of that, you've got the UKIP deputy leader Paul Nuttall is standing there for the third time, but now he's got an increased media persona. He's much more well known, and that could have an effect on the Labour vote. He'd have to get 60% of people who didn't vote for him to vote for him in the last election to this election, which may suggest he'd become a strong second place. I've spoke to the MP for Birkenhead, Frank Field. He reckons he's going to be a strong second place. The former MP for Bootle, he's looked at UKIP and said if he was standing, he'd see them as very serious threats. So I think Paul Nuttall, he could be a very strong second in Bootle, which has had very, very few Conservative votes over the past 70 years.
I've often thought that, the Labour candidate could go and shoot everybody's dog in Bootle and still win.
Okay, brilliant. So with regards to Ed Miliband and approval ratings, what effect may his have on the Labour vote?
I'd argue that in Merseyside it'd have much less of an effect. Perhaps in Wirral West it may, but in other of the safer seats in the Liverpool area, it wouldn't have as much effect. I think there is a mentality of hereditary voting and tribal voting, you could argue, in Merseyside and in Liverpool specifically. But there's also a hereditary ideology that stems from families, not just people saying I vote Labour because my parents vote Labour, but I believe in this because this happened to my parents. My parents lived in Thatcher's Britain. My parents were dockers. My parents were miners, and that's quite important to remember. Coming to other areas such as South Dorset, which is a Labour target seat, it may have a little bit more of an effect because the area, like I said, is much more conservative than Merseyside.
It is now not a strong trade union county, it has to be said.
South Dorset is much more of in areas such as Weymouth, more of a Labour voting area as well for the region. You could argue that there is a chance that Labour might win it back.
The constituency of South Dorset was won in 2010 by Conservative Richard Drax, with a majority of 7,443. This is Labour's best chance of a seat in Dorset, with extensive campaigning in areas such as Weymouth. Labour's Simon Bowkett is offering the strongest opposition to Drax.
I think the parties will be fighting 650 different elections at this election. We'll be fighting 650 different elections, which is quite unusual. When people vote, they tend to vote for either the Conservatives, the Labour Party, or the Liberal Democrats in some cases. Now we've got the UK Independence Party, we've got the Green Party, we've got the SNP in Scotland, which is going to be very influential in dictating who runs the country, and that is why politics is going to be much more localised at this election. It's going to be very unpredictable, which all the parties know. They'll all be saying, like, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party will be fighting for a majority until the last day, but we of course can assume that there are plans in action for in the case of a hung parliament, which is looking extremely likely if you look at the polls. But I think one thing the polls do not suggest is the influence that the smaller parties are definitely going to have. I think because it's not a typical election, the pollsters don't have as much of a knowledge of what's going to happen. Nobody knows what's going to happen. Time will only tell what this election brings.
I think voting nationally is far less tribal than it used to be.
I still firmly believe in democratic socialism as taught and as inherited. I would suggest that Labour is strong still, locally and nationally here.
With growing student areas such as Bournemouth, for example, do you ever feel that these areas could overpower the traditional Conservative vote in the area?
I think there's a huge scope for that, the demographic changes. We have got to do a lot more work in talking to the students at places like Bournemouth University and in those towns. I mean, actually, it's really, really encouraging to see the work that is happening around Bournemouth. The Labour parties are really kind of up to their game.